Yo no me siento. Buenas tardes. De nuevo, gracias por la asistencia, como siempre. Bueno, estamos ya cerca del final, la séptima conferencia de LCLA. Sí, esta vez va a hablar. Es curiosamente, como la vez anterior, hay un americano que va a hablar en un ciclo de Europa Europa. O sea que tenemos aquí a Luís Callejas, que es de Medellín, y después tenemos a la socia Charlotte, aunque hablará Luis, pero bueno, que es de Medellín, aunque afincado en Oslo. Y para presentar la conferencia, pues tenemos a Beatriz Borque, arquitecta y paisajista, y reciente ganadora del premio de la FIRA con Esmiller Radic.
Bueno, pues nada, bueno, gracias a todos por venir, también por invitarme, Moisés, a presentar a Charlotte Hansson y a Luís Callejas, que forman el estudio LCLA. Y nada, la verdad que para presentarlos, así muy brevemente, la verdad es que es un estudio que a mí hace tiempo que me interesa mucho y la verdad es que por varias razones, ¿no? Aparte de porque trabajan de alguna manera indistintamente, ¿no? Como arquitectura y paisaje entendido desde ese marco, ¿no? en el que puede estar como la arquitectura o incluso el paisaje casi como vehículo, ¿no? Para llevar a esa arquitectura y viceversa. Y sobre todo me interesa como su trabajo por la ambigüedad con la que de alguna forma ellos parecen mostrar, ¿no? Su trabajo, que a veces, digamos, es difícil como diferenciar, ¿no? Si se trata de un proyecto suyo, si se trata como de un viaje, de una excursión, o si se trata de un trabajo de investigación, ¿no? Sobre todo a través como de documentos fotográficos, de documentos de arquitectura, de fotos de arquitectura, etcétera, ¿no? Pero sí que es verdad que es interesante como esa ambigüedad, y también yo creo que es la ambigüedad también entre trabajar entre arquitectura y paisaje, ¿no? También la ambigüedad en la escala, ¿no? También veo que es algo como muy interesante el tema de cómo trabajan desde la escala, ¿no? De la escala más grande, pero sobre todo a partir de esa visión un poco hacia la naturaleza, y luego también de una escala como de detalle, ¿no? Como muy apurada y muy cuidada, ¿no? Entonces yo creo que sobre todo me quedaría con esta idea como un poco de transversalidad o de ambigüedad a la hora de trabajar, pero también a la hora de explicar su trabajo. Y yo creo que también en este ámbito también entra, yo creo que es importante el ámbito el trabajo que dedicáis a la investigación y a la docencia, ¿no? Porque tú, Luis, también das clase en la escuela de Oslo en un estudio, ¿no? Entre arquitectura y paisaje. Yo creo que precisamente donde hay a veces estudiantes, me parece, de arquitectura y otros de paisaje, entonces creo que precisamente, ¿no? Como toda esta manera de enfocar su trabajo, también como un poco aparentemente, como vuestras vivencias, ¿no? Pero al mismo tiempo es esa manera de cómo trasladarlo, digamos, como al mundo de la docencia y de la investigación. Y bueno, nada, sin más, ya de que empieces la conferencia.
Gracias.
Cuando hables, acércate al micro.
Sí. Gracias, Moisés, Beatriz. Me encanta estar acá. Voy a hacer esto en inglés. He reconocido a algunos que hablan inglés acá y Charlotte también está acá. Charlotte debería estar acá conmigo, pero decidió viajar a final de tarde y la haré yo solo. Yo creo que la introducción que estabas haciendo es muy acertada. So I will try to speak mainly about this ambiguity, or what you describe as ambiguity, which I like to think more as an attitude towards scale, as something that is really something very plastic. And that plasticity of scale is precisely what allows us to connect the scales of what we can call landscape or landscape architecture with architecture, which in our view doesn't make too much sense to create a distinction between both. I will show also mainly projects that move between these scales in a kind of undisciplined way. So this sketch in the right, which I did in a hotel not so long ago, I think tries to explain a little bit of what I mean between this connection between these two disciplines that of course affects our work, but in my view also affects our generation. As you probably know well, maybe, you know, physics and chemistry, two very solid disciplines, are not the same for sure. They will be still autonomous disciplines, but in very specific moments in the 20th century, they get together, particularly since quantum physics and different phenomena that pushes these two disciplines to get together in the 20th century. And in my view, that is exactly what is happening with architecture and landscape architecture. In the 20th century, these two disciplines, they like to stay separated, but they get together in a specific moment. Sometimes those moments happen because of a project, as opposed to a disciplinary motivation. I think it's more of a kind of practice-based motivation, a project that requires us to think together. Sometimes they separate in the search, again, for autonomy. And I think what concerns us, and by us I mean our generation and our generation that was educated after 2000, is that I think we are in one of those moments, that's today, when these two disciplines get together. And I don't consider that to be, in a way, something that we can evade. We can choose to ignore it. Some of my friends, landscape architects, like to do that. Some architects also like to do that as well. But to me, many concerns that we like to consider as contemporary concerns, such as climate change, ecology, and so on, this is precisely the proof that these two disciplines, in fact, in a similar way that physics and chemistry, when quantum physics arise, they need to be somehow discussed at the same time. It's interesting to be part of this cycle, which is about Europe in many ways. But my practice, as some of you might know, started really in Colombia and Medellin. And through the project, not through the academia in a way, is when we started to work in between these two disciplines with a particular project, which was the Aquatic Center for the South American Games, a competition we decided to do in 2007. We won. 2008, we started to work on it, and became an ambiguous project that, in a way, cemented still today how we like to work in terms of the scale and media, and it was a public project. So obviously, it's not a coincidence that that moment in Medellin, when progressive politics became important in order to push public agendas as something that architects should care for, also in a way created that kind of foundation for our practice. But I will not speak too much about that, but more about recent work. And again, this idea that scale is something plastic and is what connects these different ways to see the world and the work. This drawing is not ours. That is a drawing by Gunnar Asplund and Sigurd Leverens that I'm sure many of you know who they are. Two Swedish architects that work on what I think is probably one of the most incredible landscape projects, which contains also incredible buildings, which is the Woodland Cemetery in Stockholm. And these were two architects that I have no evidence, but I don't think they were known to be architects with a very good sense of humor, very serious, severe guys. And then when looking at the drawings of this project that we have, in a way, kind of followed for many decades, I found this drawing, which is the drawing of the ceremonial pool in the cemetery. So a very important part of the project. It's a landscape project in the sense that it's a large-scale landscape with forested areas and so on. But that fragment, which very much reveals that they are finding the way to do landscape through the mechanism of the drawing. Again, these are two very talented architects that had never done landscape before. And if you know a little bit about them, particularly Leverens, you know that they also like to do details and lamps and fixtures and so on. I don't think it's a coincidence that this looks like a light bulb in section. It's too much of a stretch. So again, I have no evidence, but I think the drawing is self-explanatory. It's a light bulb in section. I think, or I like to think, that these two architects, through their conversation, through the mechanism of the drawing, and through testing, again, the plasticity of scale, found the way to deal with the scale of landscape. And in a kind of undisciplined way, by the way, that part of the project ended up being very differently, but this is one of the original intentions for the ceremonial pond. So it's architects, which is one of the reasons I think the project is, by the way, overdrawn. They were doing many drawings, much more than they needed. So there is an expertise in landscape. I think a landscape architect will have probably done that project with fewer drawings. In other words, I think they were figuring it out. And that's what we do. So I will start again because of the conference, which is mainly about, again, European architecture. I like to start with a project that is about Norway and Europe at the same time. And it's a project that deals with the idea of the void and the clearing as architecture, or proto-architecture, perhaps it's a better way to call it. What you see on the left is a photograph of a forest clearing, which it's in Norway, but it's a photograph that could have been taken anywhere with forested land, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, until you realize that in plan they look very particular. So the idea of this void as architecture is something that has been very important in this project. Through the mechanism of the drawing and the survey, we realized that those clearings have very strange and quirky shapes. They are not like these brutal, squarish cuts that you see sometimes in flying over United States or Canada. So there is a specific beauty to these clearings that is informed by the intelligence of who did those clearings, because it's very inefficient forestry. And we started to look at which ones of those spaces might have similar proportions or dimensions to some canonical, let's say, open spaces defined by trees, from bosquets in the work of Lenotre, or that type of space. It's a kind of space defined by a perimeter of trees, even though the kind of geometric logics are derived from architecture. In the same way that we can also look at architects that have used the forest as a space of architectural inspiration, such as Henrik Tessen of German. This is very important in that tradition. So the first thing we did is curating those clearings, and by clarifying the shape, and by that I mean editing the perimeter. So it's not just the clearings as found. We are suggesting that these could perhaps become civic spaces in the city that might be even more vital than the actual civic spaces in the city. If you have been to Oslo, or you know a little bit about Oslo, you might know that it's not a city of plazas and squares in the same way that Barcelona is, or many cities in Italy. In many ways, public space is kind of dead on a weekend, not because it's not there, but because the forest is used as a civic space. So we just wanted to suggest what will happen if you will clarify the shape through addition, a little bit like doing a haircut, to these clearings, and claim that these spaces could become these voids as civic architecture. Questions of size and proportions are informed, again, by examples that we all know, so that helps us determine and also reduce the number of clearings. In the same way that some architects that have interested in this figure as architecture, maybe you know about Alvar Aalto's father was a forester. Many like to relate his forms to lakes. I think they relate more actually to forest than lakes. And later on, when we moved to Europe, we decided to test that idea together with Maximilian Schob to see what will happen if you do the same search for the whole Europe. That means automatizing the search in some way, or automatizing the search of beauty, which we did through computation, in order to look for clearings that might have similar proportions and dimensions to those that I explained before. As we can automatize it, these are many thousands of clearings all over Europe that have similar geometric logics and are also open to addition. So it's a kind of European project that we are thinking as an idea for the new European Bauhaus. What is interesting is that it's an exercise on the geometrization of space, and then what are the minimum additions to those geometries in order for these clearings to be clarified as proto-architecture in a way. Jumping into Versailles, a plan that maybe many of you know, or you have been or seen. The palace is not so interesting. Of course, it's huge, but the kind of Baroque architecture of the palace is actually quite banal compared to the invention that was the garden and the waterworks. So we were very interested in the idea that the important inventions that happen there are happening in the landscape scale, and what happens to that landscape in order to be what it is and what it was, as opposed to the palace. But also, again, the idea that scale is important when looking at this geometry, that it's seemingly rigid, right? Like we look at the geometries of that plan and we recognize attitudes to axiality and geometry that are maybe derived from the palace, but that acquire a new kind of meaning and value once they are scaled to that size. So, for instance, the fountain excavated by the Swiss Guard is 400 meters. It's a scale that is not architecture anymore when it's so flat. And when you see a corner that is seemingly rigid in plan, it becomes, in fact, softer. Or the fact that some of these pools have almost like their own climate and weather, and they have different types of waves simply because they are so large that the geometry starts to be less important than what it is. So fascinated by that, and the fact that a corner is a corner, you can zoom in infinitely in a corner. We responded to that this invitation a couple of years ago to develop a space in what used to be the questions tables, which nowadays is the architecture school, but also this space where they have many of the casts that are in the Louvre but are not in use. So you see the scale of the building where we were compared to the scale of the waterworks. Everything in black is the waterworks in Versailles. That's the pool excavated by the Swiss Guard, the long one, for scale. So again, with this idea of a scale as something plastic, we wanted to do two things. Also a bit critical of this format of biennales, which is always very strange because you're pushed to spend money and budget and energy in something that sometimes is ephemeral, and we always want to see projects as permanent somehow, but also see projects as double. Is made for the thing, but it's also about something else. It's something we want to test. And in this case, what we wanted to test is the project as a model for a new pond for Versailles, so a 1:50 pond. But at 1:1, it has to be something, right? Because that's what they're inviting us to do. And again, we're interested in two things. We're interested in the waterworks, but also the fact that the old building used to host horses. It was at some point the most sophisticated veterinary facility in Europe. In fact, the other building that is across the street, it still has the equestrian, the school. And there were these contraptions that you see there where the horse is, that used to be for the horses to drink and eat. So we were also interested in that scale of the object. And again, the fact that this building that was meant to be for horses or that was as a space for animals then became something else. The architecture school, but also the space for the casts. So again, at 1:50, it's something. It's a 1:50 model of a new pond. At 1:1, it's a fountain for horses to drink water. And obviously, the idea that geometry is informed by the geometry that is there, but read at a different scale with subtle modifications. It's similar to the clearings. What gives away what it is at 1:1 is the height, which is the same size as one of those ponds for horses. But in plan, it's just a pond with 1 ton of water distributed in a 1 centimeter sheet of water. It was made to be permanent, so it could be permanent if they wanted to make it permanent. And again, in the context of the architecture school, it's a scale that allows the students perhaps to understand the scale of the waterworks. But at 1:1, it's for horses to drink water because there are still horses in the building nearby. And horses have not been strange in a way to this landscape. This is the Bassin de Neptune, which had horses in a way. So we place these little horses in silver that also give away the other scale of the piece. But the project really is this, which is what I describe as the speculative project, which is the new pond for Versailles, which obviously they won't give us, never. But that was the project. That was our contribution. And with a similar attitude, this is a project that we developed in Germany for the Frankfurt Book Fair. Some of you might know it's a very important book fair, perhaps the most important one in the world. And every year, or every time it happens, not every year, a different country gets to be the guest of honor. So Norway was the guest of honor in 2019, I think, something like yeah. And we won the competition with a project that we didn't think we will win because it was a bit strange in the sense that this is not working. Yeah, now it is. So we did this project with Manteikula from Norway, and we decided that that it was a time to give the space for people in literature to show their landscape, and in a way the landscape in literature as opposed to the real landscape. In many ways, as a critique to maybe you're familiar, Norway, every time that it goes abroad in these kind of events, there's a bit too much of a dependence on these images of fjords and landscapes, which are obviously very beautiful. But we thought that is perhaps too much to always push for that when you get the opportunity to actually discuss culture. So we wanted a space devoid of landscape in a way, while still making it about landscape, which is this composition of tables. We can call them tables. They are a bit smaller than the pond that I just showed. So they can display books, but they are also in a way making a connection to the landscape, both of the islands, but also of the clearings, and also in section as a kind of imaginary landscape which connects to specific poems. So when we look at the sections of these things that we developed, once we got specific poems from Norwegian literature abroad, we developed forms that relate to poems that were translated to German. Is it okay? Yeah, thank you. And I think what is important about this is that we were very conscious and interested in the idea that that Germans were very interested in Norwegian literature, and there is a connection between both languages, and that these poems could be maybe misinterpreted depending on who's the public, and that those interpretations of the poems were very open in the same way that these forms are very open. So we did very loose interpretations of those poems that maybe, in fact, most of them relate to nature, but we didn't want nature to be there in a way. Another decision that we took, which is important in our work generally, is that we normally don't have this type of interior commissions for events, but we like, again, to design them as if they are permanent. So we propose that these tables will be very well made in aluminum, and that they could stand outdoors. So they are really designed as park furniture. They cannot be disassembled, for instance. They need to move complete. So the idea is that after the fair, which lasts only 4 days, they will go into parks or bookshops and so on. So many were adopted by different institutions after. Similar to the Biennale, a bit critical to this idea of the temporariness of the project, and always thinking what else can become. There is some nature there, which are these photographs by Per Bentsen, a photographer that takes photos of forests around Norway that are inhabited by Samis who really don't care really about these borders that much. We wanted to provoke also the German public, which is a bit obsessed with this idea of going to Norway in order to experience pristine nature, but these forests are actually managed. And they're not natural in the sense that there is culture there, which is the culture of the Samis who inhabit those spaces. That's why those were the only images of forest that we wanted. But again, it's another project where the scale of the object is connected somehow with architecture and the scale of the landscape. This is a recent project completed 1 year ago with Lundhagen, an office from Oslo, and an atelier Oslo. In this one, we only work outside. It's a preservation project. The building was originally designed by Eero Saarinen. You probably know him, a Finnish-American architect, more recognized as an American architect. So he developed most of his work in the United States. And as part of the Plan Marshall, which was when the United States was helping Europe after the war, some embassies were developed with the idea that embassies should be more like cultural center as opposed to these bunkers, which is what they are today, especially US embassies. It's a bit smaller than the one in London, but very beautiful. And for many years it was closed. So we won the competition to renovate it. It's a beautiful building. It's a gorgeous building with a beautiful space, an atrium in the middle of the building that was, we always thought that Saarinen would have liked this space to be, if not public, at least possible to visit. But obviously, because of security reasons and many events that have happened since the Second World War, the embassy becomes more and more close. So for instance, the first American embassy that was bombed, Yemen, I believe, security measures, all the way to 9/11, where the embassy is completely enclosed by fences and security devices. So it's a space that also many Norwegians have never get to experience, which is what we thought landscape could be so interesting, because it's first the opportunity to open the building to the public, but second is the only thing that can be really new, as the building is obviously more of a project of restoration, and so the role of authorship is very different. So it's a landscape that could be authored, because what was there to replace is this band of space, or that was mainly parking, and the areas for security. We also discovered that Saarinen himself didn't have very precise plans for that area. So very likely, even back then, even if it not was security, there was an idea of having American cars like Cadillacs and so on, which were also in a way part of culture. It's very funny, actually. The building had a little gas station in the facade for the diplomatic delegation. He suggested these trees, which were some of them planted, some not. It was not a very sophisticated outdoor space from the beginning, which also made it possible to actually suggest something more sophisticated. This is the first drawing that is ours, which is basically starting to think about that space and what that band of space can be in relationship to Saarinen's original idea. There was not much to grab on, only two things. One is the idea of car culture, which is interesting, these lines, right? And the fact that the Americans were interested in showing cars. But also the fact that in Oslo it's not uncommon that the pavement goes all the way to the facade. So that was important, but also the fact, that's the little gas station there. The fact that that Saarinen had a very specific attitude to ground buildings, which was, as I like to think, something that he learned in America, similar to Utzon. In fact, they did some travels together. They traveled to Mexico, saw pre-Hispanic temples in Mexico. This is a story that is quite known. Mark Weekly writes very beautifully about it, about how this kind of generation of Scandinavia's architects went to America in order to understand the kind of power of the ground plane, and especially what they saw in Mexico. There's a beautiful story also about the Opera House, also relating to that, by Utzon. You can do anything as long as you have a kind of solid plinth. Saarinen was jury of the Opera House, as you might know. Anyway, we were very interested in this idea of something that Saarinen maybe could have done, but he couldn't do because it was an embassy. But also the fact that that he liked stones, and that the stones were important as a way to kind of ground these buildings. This is a picture that he took in Mexico. But again, it's very difficult to find where to introduce newness in such a project. In this case, the scale of the stone became very important. So we did this paving in very large river stones that have a scale that is a little bit larger than the originals in order to make it more public, and also play with the levels, which were not very clearly distinguished from before. So that's the front towards the palace. That's only the stonework. And then the other two sides, which is where they used to have cars, is more a game of leveling and a new entrance that takes people under the embassy and inside the building. So it's basically a floor. And it's the architecture of that floor and the connection with, in a way, Saarinen's idea of how to ground a public building, but in this case, flattening it, as opposed to being just stone. And in some areas, actually, the asphalt gets all the way to the building, which is, again, something not uncommon in Norway, but It's not the most glamorous way to reach a public building, but we think it has a kind of interesting connection also with car culture and public space in Norway. And along those lines, projects recently that we have been doing for the roads administration, which is the branch of the government that is in charge of maintaining roads and highways in Norway. And they have this beautiful program that has been running for 3 decades now, which is called the Norwegian Scenic Routes. It's basically the idea of having architects and landscape architects doing projects along these beautiful roads with fjords and islands and so on. Maybe some of you have seen these projects. Many architects have participated in this program. So we won the competition, or we were one of the winners to develop projects for them for the next 4 years. But again, we are not Norwegian. Charlotte is from Sweden. I'm from Colombia originally. We think that we can relate to these landscapes, but we don't kind of have this kind of original. There's a bit of a kind of dogma to the way to treat these landscapes that sometimes I find a bit problematic, which is the idea that you need to understand them in a way deeply. And that understanding of that landscape can only come if somehow you have lived them, but we haven't. So I like to say that we are equally interested in that story, but also on the story of roadside architecture. That's actually a building by, I forgot the name. It's a very famous building in Sunset Boulevard. It's a shop. I'll remember later. It's this idea, it's a very specific episode of American architecture, which is when architecture needs to do some kind of gesture in order to attend that condition of the road. And we're equally interested in that as a phenomena in the same way as the landscape. Another interesting thing for us is the reading of those landscapes happens not only through photography, but also through sophisticated surveys. In this case, a LiDAR survey with a very high degree of resolution that allows us, if not to relate to this landscape via experience, at least through the way of understanding the drawing. It's a laser scan of the landscape that, for instance, reveals chlorophyll, so you can see actually vegetation in a landscape that is seemingly barren, and reveals geometries that are maybe hidden, or at least not as transparent if you just go there and visit and photograph. Lotner, it's John Lotner that did that, yeah. So from there, we move to the plan, which again is in my view, is the projection that allows us to connect a scale in a way that is undisciplined, because the section reveals the scale. Immediately when you get into section, you get into construction methods, which is interesting, but later. The plan is elastic enough so that you can actually relate to the scale of the object, the landscape, architecture, and so on. So it often starts with some kind of plan that is informed, in this case, by the high-resolution topographical survey, and from there models, and models that are in many ways very direct. So for instance, this landscape is mainly almenite, which is a stone that is supposed to be more common in the moon. It's in fact one of the areas of the world with more of that stone. So it's a kind of moon landscape. And it's also a stone that gets transformed into titanium dioxide, which is white paint. So most white paint today it has titanium dioxide, and it's a big industry there that has been running for 100 years. So the kind of making of that model and the attitude towards the project is equally informed by what we see, but also the kind of composition that we learn of that landscape, which is the stones that are crushed into smaller stone and smaller stones until they become white paint or toothpaste. That's why toothpaste is white, by the way, because of that stone. And we propose a little building, not so dissimilar to what is normally done for the scenic routes. In the scenic routes, normally the buildings enter in a dialogue with the landscape, which is mainly poetic, but we also wanted to relate to the kind of industrial landscape of the site, which is, again, this production of white paint and white pigment. And in terms of scale, which is very modest, it's a restroom, it's a toilet for the road. We wanted a form that could be easily misunderstood for industrial architecture from a car. Something that if you don't pay too much attention, you don't know what it is, but also you don't know what size it is, even though it's just a toilet. the scale of the handrail becomes also very important. Little details such as this small sphere, which is a moon with titanium dioxide finish. And recently we are developing another one in Lofoten, which is very far up north. This is above the Arctic Circle. Another small restroom and toilet for the road. They need to be very robust and durable. This one is all in aluminum. But this is more of a sea building, a beach building in a beautiful white beach with a lot of wind. So we are imagining that this will literally be sandblasted by the beach and time. So that's why it's metal. That's why it's going to be very thick. But this is where we are today with that project. It's another restroom. Moving into another project along those lines. This is one of the last buildings by Sverre. It's the National Museum in it's the National Museum for Architecture in Oslo. One of his last buildings. He was quite old and very sick already. And it's a strange building because I think because he was who he was, he already had a Pritzker. He was on top of the world, not only Norway at that time, but he was also kind of sick and old. It's an idea that is very clear, an idea that someone of that stature could push, but I don't think he had the capacity to really push it. It is said that he was even working from the hospital in that project. And he lost this part of the building, which was never done, the underground gallery. And that's why the building has a moat. This is a space around which was meant to introduce light into the underground gallery. Here you see the original model by Fenn. So that's why that space is there, because it was meant to introduce light into the underground gallery that was never completed. This is in the archive, looking at the drawings. And we don't know why no one has really worked with this, which is the idea that the building was done with that moat, that space, which is an outdoor space, even though the gallery was never finished. So what we are proposing is to flood that space around the building in order to almost double the exhibition surface outside once you consider that band as an exhibition space, but also similar to the project by Saarinen is a question of how landscape can deal with modern heritage in an interesting way by doing something new, yet somehow respectful of the author. Because it's an architecture that, yes, it is starting to be historicized, but it doesn't have very clear rules in terms of how to do that. So it's a space flooded with glass. Fenn, as you might know, loved glass, but also plastic. He even proposed a plastic column in the Brussels pavilion. So we propose fiberglass surface covered with crushed glass, recycled crushed glass, to cover that space that was supposed to be glass to introduce light to an underground space that was never built. The whole motivation for this is that space today is a very strange space. It's not used for anything. It was built because I guess it was the clarity of the idea, right? So it's flooding all that space. This is a photo of the model with glass beads. And also to extend it as an exhibition surface. So it is a landscape because I guess it's a landscape because it's outside and doesn't have a roof. But it's a way to extend the interior and be able to have also exhibitions outside. And eventually taken all the way out. And I will finish with a few projects about houses, which takes us back to the clearing and the idea of this void as architecture. It's a few projects in Colombia completed recently. A very strange landscape. Many would like to call this nature, but it is not nature. It's Australian eucalyptus, Canadian pines, which were brought for what it was a wood industry that was quite vital, which is not anymore. And this strange grass that you see on the front plane, which is they call it kikuyu. It's a grass that is very efficient for cattle, for cows, but it's almost impossible to outcompete that grass. So there's probably more biodiversity in those chairs or this floor than in that grass. It's a kind of very dead landscape in a way. And it's a landscape where many people are doing big houses, and they call it, let's move to nature, but it's basically a wasteland, which is a combination of clearings for cattle and cows with grass, and the remnants of that forest, which is a forest that it doesn't work in the same way as in a Nordic country. As you might know, the pines, if you don't have winter, they are too weak, they die very soon. The wood is actually not so good. So it started as an experiment on how to situate a house at the edge of a clearing, as if architecture, yes, is the clearing, but you still need some kind of little building in order to sustain life. And that little building should be an incident in the clearing, as opposed to be in the middle of it, which is maybe how it was more done in the past. Some of them are not built, and they depend on this idea that if you put a small house at the edge of a clearing, as opposed to in the center, you might have a part of the house with a lot of light, a part without so much light. So you might also make the space feel much larger than it really is. It's also an experiment on these two types of clearings, which are interesting to me. The planted, that is when you actually plant the trees with a shape. So when you decide where to put the trees, so you actually have control of that line, versus the edited, which is when you're more like doing a haircut. You're authoring by removing from a mass. That's in the case of the old trees, which are around 80-year-old, probably. So two very different forms of authorship in a mass. That is one by subtraction, one by addition. The one below is for a client that has the time to actually go through this process so the landscape can evolve. While the one on the top is an 87-year-old artist, and that's why the clearing needs to be planted. He has no time. And this is in fact, the trees are trees that are maybe not the best trees to do this, but they are important because they define space very quickly. The other thing that is important is the idea that if architecture is simply a way to create a kind of incident in a space that is defined by a void, that space is often a slope, as it's common in Colombia. So once you insert a wall, such as a retention wall, you produce immediately some kind of interior. So two of the houses are experimenting with the idea of the retention wall as minimal gesture to define architecture. And this is what happens. Also the idea that by making it very thin, the space, again, is completed by the space of the clearing, but also the house starts to become very abstract. It doesn't really give away what it is, which is also something interesting to us. Or the decision to make it very flat in order to have contrast with the topography and the perimeter of the trees. And again, that once you intersect a wall with a slope, you start to produce some kind of idea of an interior. It was intentionally fragmented in two in order to have two very different experiences. It could have been a larger house. That's how the commission started. We decided to fragment it actually in three, but the third part is not built yet. They have very similar surface area, around 64 square meters. But the idea is that you move in between two houses. One is much more introverted, the one that is a retention wall. The other one is you have 360 degrees, much more extroverted. But they have the same program. So you have same material, same details, but very different proportions. So whoever is living there, moving between the two houses, can get to feel very different depending on which house they decide to occupy. And this photo is important. It's an old tree that we removed, and we start to, again, it's almost like doing a haircut, edit that edge in order to qualify that space. So I don't like to think that this is an exercise on minimal living, rather the opposite. It's trying to claim that the clearing is the house and architecture is the minimum you need in order to use this as a domestic space. Obviously, it's easier in the tropics because you have no winter. Many activities can happen open air, almost all year round. And this is probably informed by us living in Norway. In a way, longing for the tropics gives you distance, but in a way, proximity too. I'm not totally sure we would have done this work in Colombia. So I think distance from the context is also, it allows you to somehow take risks in a way. and to also value these conditions, such as not having winter. Imagine designing this from the winter in Oslo, and you're like, oh, you can't be outside. So it's really kind of pushing the possibilities of the tropical condition, which I think in some ways happens because we are not there. Same for the garden. It's a strange garden. Páramo, I don't know if you know the word, but the páramo is a very particular ecosystem that only happens above 3,000 meters in elevation. I believe only in Latin America, Ecuador, Colombia. It's above the tree line. There's no trees. There is this plant which is called frailejón that grows 1 centimeter per year. It's a plant that doesn't grow below 3,000, maybe 2,800 meters. You cannot use it commercially, obviously. And it's this world of very thick plants, very beautiful. It's a very magical landscape, but you cannot recreate that landscape. It's impossible. Also, there's no reason to build in the páramo. Most of páramos are protected for good reasons. It's a landscape that has been very important to me in many ways, as an image also. And we thought, what if we recreate a páramo? We cannot get these plants, but we can get, that's actually, sorry, on the top right, that's a very banal plant. That's a palma yucca. It's like one of the cheapest. You normally see it in a, it's not a frailejón, but it's there because it's the cheap plant that is more similar to the precious one. So it's a kind of very postmodern landscape in the sense that we're using plants that look like other plants, and by relying on this constant fog of this place, which is quite high, it's 2,100 meters above the sea, it almost makes things look as however you want them to look, especially at that time in the morning. So it's very scenographic in that sense. So it's a landscape of plants that looks like other plants. Some of them are actually quite banal and cheap. Some of them are more precious and found in the mountain. And but it's also an experiment in details. I think many architects have played with the idea of connecting interior and exterior through visual means, you know, big windows and so on. We like to think that interior and exterior also connects through the detail in interesting ways. So if you have the same detail outside in the pavement of a sidewalk, all the way to the deepest, most intimate space, like a shower, you actually get a much more kind of fluid connection. So what we want to avoid, again, which is something that we see mainly in Scandinavia, is that you first have the concrete, then the stone, then the wood. And then in the bathroom, you might have a space with tiles, right? So you have this kind of gradient of materials that become more and more precious as you go to the inside. So I don't think they are brutalists. I think what they are is an experiment on finding the same details and same logics outside and inside and try to see how far we can push that. So for instance, the canal to take the water from the roof is the same detail in the shower, same dimensions. So obviously overly dimensioned for a shower detail, which is here. But it's important visually that you see the same way to solve a constructive problem outside and inside in a very intimate space, such as the shower. Or some strange decisions, such as using that shower by, it's a Danish shower that is for outdoors. We use an outdoor shower inside in order to bring, I don't think it's even a kind of poetic decision, it's to bring some kind of memory of being outside. I think they're also simply better made. So using outdoor stuff inside is kind of safe. And the garden is much more detailed and precious. So it's also the contrast between the garden and the architecture, which is mainly concrete and steel. So there you see the palma yuccas, which are standing from frailejones, together with some wild orchids. And then there is the space in between the clearing and the garden, which is managed by mowing. So it's just cutting. So in landscape, different than architecture, you need to think about maintenance as authorship, which is an interesting dimension to landscape. So for instance, the gardeners that maintain that garden close to the house, they need to be more expert and they need to know what they're doing. Then there is that space in between, which is just cutting, so that that landscape doesn't completely invade the landscape of the garden, which is obviously much more pressure. So it's editing, then cutting with intention. So there's a geometry that they more or less follow. And then the garden, which is much more kind of design. And again, details that connect the idea of a large space with a small one. So the park lamp is very important in that house. It's a lamp we designed to look like a park lamp, but also introduces light to the house. For us, it has become a kind of obsession that if you are inside the house, you can turn off all the lights and you get to have light from outside only. So to use the exterior lamp to have light in the house is very important. So you can turn off all the lights and have the light from outside. Then the details, of course, which we also enjoy in Latin America, it's possible still today to manufacture many things that in some parts of Europe is not so common. So like the window profiles, for instance, and these kind of things. Not so easy to do in Latin America. An interesting story is that we had to do it with the milk tank welders. It's as I said, it's an area of cattle. And these people that they do milk tanks, because the weldings need to be certified, we discovered they are the best to do this kind of work. They don't really get the drawings, which was also an interesting part of the process. But we ended up using them to build, windows and details and so on. And what I was saying, the details outside repeat inside, and the different grains of the concrete are somehow in conversation, outside and inside. There's not much modesty in this space, so it's only one curtain that can be used to divide the space if necessary, with a very strange shape, which is not really efficient for having a dinner or working, but that's actually where the magic is in a way. And when you see the geometry of these spaces in plan, they are very similar to the geometries of the garden outside. Yeah, here is more clear a little bit, because the garden was quite new, what is planted versus what is edited. And that's 1 year after, so it's very fast in Medellin. So you can also rely on that kind of speed in order to produce the work. One day it was completely eaten by cows. This is something, I am an architect, but I didn't know, as an architect, the worst thing that can happen to your work is fire and earthquake. But as a landscape architect, your work can be eaten. And it happened. It was something we learned, so we had to do it again because of that. And as I said, the deepest interiors relate somehow to the exteriors. This is the one that has a square plan. It shakes, there's earthquakes in Colombia. So gravity is not a problem, it's more this problem, which is sideways. So the structures need to be very robust. So how do you make the structure into furniture became interesting in this house in order not to have almost any furniture. So it's a house that cantilevers in all directions. It needs to be symmetric because of the earthquakes again. But yes, as I said, the thickness of the beams define the furniture, which is also practical in a context where you might leave it 2 months and people can break in and so on. So for instance, all these spaces have drainage, similar to an outdoor space. If a window breaks or a pipe breaks, you cannot have the house suddenly doing this. So the interior needs to drain in order not to, which is unusual in a way. And this is the constructed clearing, which is, it has probably 1/5 of the budget of the concrete houses, so it's much more modest. But here the problem was to produce this space for an 87-year-old artist who's very vital still and wants to have this compact living in a house that is also used for exhibitions and actually still work. It's a singular retention wall in brick. And the element that takes the water down from the roof also behaves as a structural reinforcement for the earthquakes to stabilize the long wall. It's only 40 square meters. And the space has 2 levels in order to use it for exhibitions and work. But also areas such as the shower, which can become exhibition spaces. They have a different dimension precisely because of that. Structurally, it's interesting. There's no rocks. It's mainly clay, which is also why we use bricks here. It's a region with a tradition of clay craftsmanship and artists, which is why he moved there. and it's cut. It's like cheese almost. You can cut the terrain. And it's actually an illegal foundation. This could only happen because we are very close and most likely will never be sold. But there's a problem in Colombia, which is that the earthquake regulations pushes for concrete or steel. So even a small house ends up with half of the budget, especially a very small house inside the terrain. This is a floating foundation. So the house is literally floating. It's what the farmers used to do. We sink it a bit even more, so it will float more, and has one singular element, which has the only concrete pile, which is the one that you see. Which again, in a cheap house, is also the only opportunity to have some kind of presence for the house, which is that element that you see in the section, which is, again, taking the water down from the thin roof, which is 18 millimeter thick, the roof in aluminum. It's a roof that could not have been done at a higher elevation or lower, so it's oddly contextual. I think if it will be lower, it will be too hot, and higher up will be too cold for that thinness. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Muchas gracias, Luis. Pasamos al turno de preguntas. ¿Alguien quiere hacer alguna pregunta, alguna observación? Tenemos aquí a Beatriz, que igual la quiere hacer.
No, bueno, básicamente hacer como un comentario y bueno, también un poco pregunta, pero nada. La verdad es que, bueno, se ve, bueno, esto que hablábamos al principio, ¿no? Como de la ambigüedad y tal, pero digamos, este diálogo entre paisaje y arquitectura realmente es como muy evidente. O sea, al final siempre habéis acabado explicando todos los proyectos desde ese diálogo, digamos, con el paisaje, ¿no? O sea, cuando es arquitectura en la Embajada de Estados Unidos, ¿no? El edificio de Saarinen o de FEN, digamos, como trayendo el paisaje, ¿no? Contenido, ¿no? Alrededor digamos, de una arquitectura. O por otro lado, digamos, en estos casos, bueno, que al final son como un poco opuestos, ¿no? En el caso de las rutas panorámicas de Noruega, ¿no? Cuando realmente es el paisaje, ¿no? Como tan inmenso, la naturaleza, y es el hecho de colocar como un elemento, o en cambio aquí como el hecho de cómo construir ese paisaje, ¿no? Para de alguna forma generar ese diálogo o restablecer ese diálogo, en este caso artificial, entre la arquitectura y el paisaje, ¿no? Y entonces, no, simplemente era como una reflexión y luego también como preguntarnos. Al final siempre, digamos, es una necesidad esto de siempre trabajar, digamos, o partir como de ese diálogo con el paisaje, ¿no? En cualquier proyecto, ¿no? O es porque el proyecto se da por las condiciones, ¿no? Físicas del lugar. Bueno, un poco esto.
Sí, no, yo creo que no es una necesidad. Y por eso el dibujo de Leverens y Asplund es tan lindo. No tenían ni idea de cómo hacer eso. Y de repente el dibujo de la lámpara era más útil que... Y les pasa algo similar. Yo creo que algunos paisajes son muy fuertes y obviamente muy valiosos. Algunos incluso son como, tienen una carga como de identidad nacional, como los de la ruta noruega, donde te piden de alguna manera arrancar por ahí. Pero hay paisajes también que han sido transformados de una manera muy brutal, como estos paisajes de agricultura fuerte. Incluso el paisaje de los pinos y los claros, tú lo podrías llamar un desastre ecológico. Es decir, es lindo, es bonito, pero tiene un valor ecológico cero. Entonces, en ese sentido, la arquitectura también puede ser la manera de entrarle, y la geometría. Entonces, creo que la respuesta es más como no somos moralistas en el sentido de que no hay que obedecer el paisaje como un tema como dogmático, donde el sitio te va a decir lo que tienes que hacer. A veces el sitio no te dice nada. A veces tú le tienes que decir al sitio qué va a pasar ahí. Y es un tema un poco tabú, creo que sobre todo entre paisajistas puede ser, o también arquitectos como de cierta corriente. Pero la realidad es que muchos de nosotros vamos a tener que trabajar en sitios que han sido modificados de una manera muy brutal, al punto de que de pronto no tienen ya información valiosa y tienes tú que llegar a introducir belleza o ideas que puede que estén informadas de otra parte. Depende del sitio. O como en los sitios de la ruta turística noruega que claro, la imagen es muy poderosa, pero la presencia de esta industria del titanio por 100 años es un paisaje cultural que lo tratamos como de elevar al mismo nivel de lo que llamarías un paisaje natural. En ese caso es interesante porque puede que el público no sepa eso, entonces también se vuelve una manera como de conectar con el paisaje cultural.
Podéis preguntar en castellano o en inglés.
Sí.
Ah,
muy bien.
Buenas, Luis. Bueno, antes que nada, gracias por estar aquí, gracias por el repertorio de imágenes y de proyectos que nos has mostrado. Y bueno, mi pregunta va un poco más de la mano de la anterior pregunta y es más que sobre todo por las referencias que pusiste al principio acerca de Versalles, de los planos de Versalles y sobre todo comparándolo con los maestros nórdicos, del respeto que tienen por el lugar, por el territorio, por lo que es el valor paisajístico y territorial de cada uno de ellos. Y me parece un poco curioso porque, bueno, a mí en la universidad me explicaron que el proyecto de Versalles, todos los jardines, tienen una huella ecológica y un poco respetable en lo que es el medio ambiente. Porque si analizas un poco cómo es el proyecto y, o sea, lo destructivo que fue en su época, porque es más o menos jugar con lo que es la naturaleza en sí misma. Y comparándolo con, por ejemplo, el cementerio de los bosques, que bueno, comentaste acerca de estos dos arquitectos, de Asplund y de Leverens, y me gustaría saber, para tu estudio y para ti, qué es lo que representa esta dicotomía entre lo que podría ser Versalles y un proyecto que no es a la misma escala, pero que sí que tiene estas intenciones de expandirse por el territorio, que es el cementerio del bosque, que viene de estos dos maestros nórdicos. Y yo no sé si esta dicotomía te ha ayudado a tomar decisiones en tus proyectos o más o menos no sé cómo lo has podido implementar.
Bueno, lo primero que te diría es que el proyecto del cementerio en el bosque también tiene una huella ecológica. Todos los paisajes diseñados y los no diseñados, a veces hasta más, como ese paisaje de las vacas y la industria de la madera. Entonces, los paisajes también tienen huella ecológica y yo no los trataría como opuestos, primero. Y creo que los dos tienen información valiosa. Versalles, claro, es un proyecto que nos han como dicho 1000 veces que, claro, también conectado como, bueno, al legado de por qué se hizo así, ¿cierto? Pero como te decía, en ese caso para nosotros fue importante también como la inteligencia de los trabajos que se hicieron con el agua, de la ingeniería. Es un poco un tema como un poco nerdy de cómo estos trabajos fueron conectados y hechos. Y sí, puede que tengan una huella ecológica. Yo, sin ser un experto en eso, te diría que eso fue hecho en un momento, ya han pasado muchos años, y el hecho de que ese proyecto siga ahí, esa huella ecológica se empieza a diluir en el tiempo. De eso sí estoy seguro también. Entonces también creo que un proyecto bello que perdura, no sé si tiene más huella ecológica que un proyecto quizá más banal que cambia, como lo hay muchos también. No sé si quiera defenderlo, pero sí también un poco. También, no sé, es que nos podríamos meter incluso en los proyectos que ha informado. ¿Cuántos proyectos no se habrían hecho de la manera que se han hecho si no fuera por lo que se hizo ahí? Entonces, el valor como interno de la disciplina también creo que es muy difícil comparar eso con la huella ecológica, pero también es interesante. El proyecto del bosque, que muchas veces se muestra como natural, no es natural. Hay unos dibujos muy bellos donde te das cuenta, por ejemplo, el problema de cómo plantar árboles con tumbas. Imagínate las raíces y las tumbas, es algo que no... Son quizá de los dibujos más interesantes de ese proyecto. Es un proyecto artificial, 100%. Claro, han pasado tantos años que los árboles ya algunos están muriendo y lo ves como un proyecto que podrías llamar natural, pero no lo es. Entonces, sí, no son tan diferentes como crees, y yo creo que eso es parte como de lo que nos interesa también, que los proyectos al aire libre, independientemente de la escala, son artificios de la misma manera que es una silla o una pieza de arquitectura. No quiero decir que el problema ético no importe, obviamente sí importa, pero para atacar ese problema ético hay que reconocer que estamos trabajando es con el artificio, no con la naturaleza.
¿Alguien quiere hacer una pregunta? Vale.
Muy buenas. Aquí. Lo primero, darte las gracias por la conferencia, me ha parecido preciosa. Y yo te quería preguntar sobre un poco la escalabilidad, ¿no? Veo que en muchos proyectos tuyos está siempre muy presente, ¿no? Ese cuidado al detalle, ¿no? En casi todas las cosas que planteáis, ¿no? Y me gustaría saber un poco, cuando os toca enfrentaros a proyectos más grandes, cómo aplicáis como oficina, ¿no? Este tipo de cosas, ¿no? Porque sí que veo que cambiáis pues, de escalas de paisaje, ¿no? Que son escalas muy, muy grandes,
Sí.
a, por ejemplo, detalles como, por ejemplo, cómo colgar la toalla en la pila, ¿no? de esta
Sí.
casa, ¿no? Entonces, me gustaría saber como oficina cómo os enfrentáis a eso.
Esa es una pregunta muy buena. Somos una oficina muy pequeña y eso afecta al trabajo de una manera que creo que es interesante, porque tú estás trabajando en un archivo, esto no es trivial, estás trabajando en un archivo de AutoCAD o de Rhino o a mano, y tú no tienes la capacidad de trabajar todo al mismo nivel de detalle, ¿verdad? Y en muchos casos no tienes ni siquiera la oportunidad. Con un proyecto, no sé, por ejemplo, el proyecto de la embajada, donde había que trabajar los detalles muy rápido. Un tema como de escoger bien dónde puedes meter la autoría y de soltar el control en zonas donde no, es bien importante con los proyectos de paisaje. Creo que a mí me gusta mucho pensar los proyectos en términos de la escala pequeña y la grande, y la intermedia no me parece tan interesante. Y es como aceptar que a veces vale la pena meterle la energía a ciertos fragmentos. Incluso como problema de dibujo es interesante. Hay como un espacio negativo en el dibujo que permanece como vacío mucho tiempo, y ese vacío también es parte del proyecto. A veces la manera de actuar en ese vacío, por ejemplo el de los claros es similar, ¿sabes? Por ejemplo estas casas que empezaron como casas y quizá era un cliente que no estaba preparado al principio para la discusión de mira, te voy a quitar este árbol, te voy a cortar este otro, pero se vuelve la manera de actuar a esa escala con el presupuesto y las horas de dibujo de una casa pequeña. Entonces, en algunos proyectos de paisaje, por eso la subtracción es importante en vez de añadir. Es un tema también de tiempo, de que los árboles son lentos, ¿verdad? Entonces creo que es un tema así, a veces como de aceptar la subtracción, pero también como el espacio negativo del dibujo. No se puede en todos los proyectos y creo que está cambiando rápidamente. En una casa como estas, por ejemplo, todavía hoy en día tú puedes tener un solo archivo. Nosotros a veces trabajamos de hecho en AutoCAD todavía. Entonces tú puedes hacer zoom in and out. Después estar dibujando algo y después pasarte a dibujar uno en 500, un jardín. Y ese cambio constante es bien interesante. Somos muy indisciplinados en ese sentido. Y por ahora hemos trabajado en ese tipo de proyectos donde tienes un archivo, por ejemplo, que no es tan disimilar a tener un modelo, por ejemplo, en BIM o algo así. Pero creo que esos programas todavía no son lo suficientemente plásticos como para darte eso. Ese es el problema.
Hej, tusen takk for presentasjonen. Muchas gracias. Yo quería preguntar sobre el baño en Lofoten, por cómo han llegado a elegir el material, por el tema de como la clima, que es bastante frío casi todo el año, y si han como por el interior, si hay algo que lo hace más suave, más como que va a ser más confortable sacarse los pantalones y ir al baño, ¿no? Si no, el espacio sea... ¿Si han pensado en eso?
Sí.
¿O cómo han pensado en eso?
Es una pregunta interesante porque esos proyectos de la ruta turística, claro, nosotros estamos acostumbrados a un baño en una casa, a un tema como mucho más sofisticado de superficies que tocas y que la piel tiene contacto, pero cuando trabajas con la ruta turística, en el primer día ellos te empujan a que estos son proyectos de carretera muy rudos, donde lo primordial es como la durabilidad. Y eso tiene resultados positivos. Yo creo que muchos de los proyectos, no nuestros, sino ya construidos de otros arquitectos, a veces son bien fuertes y te encuentras también materiales exteriores al interior que aguantan, llegan y los lavan con una manguera. Y eso nos interesa también. Entonces no creo que nos interese como domesticar ese interior mucho. y te encuentras a veces los surfistas, por ejemplo, que hacen surf en el Ártico y se meten con un wetsuit lleno de arena y lo tienen que lavar. Es otro tipo de interior, no es como el baño de una casa. Entonces tenemos el mismo material, pero con otro tipo de acabado. Es como un sandblasting, pero ese sí ya más intencional.
¿Alguna pregunta más? Si no, como siempre, vamos arriba, tomamos unas cervezas y lo tenéis como más a mano para explicar tanto a Charlotte como a Luis. Un aplauso para él.